The oldest diner in Cedar Ridge had never seen a morning like this one. Elijah Monroe, a black single father, sat quietly by the window, finishing his breakfast, when Sheriff Richard Grant walked in and stopped directly in front of his table, certain the room belonged to him. "Get away from my table right now," Grant said. When Elijah calmly refused to move, Grant called him suspicious, demanded his identification, and cuffed him in front of more than 40 stunned witnesses. Nobody said a word, though everyone in that room knew Grant had never treated a white customer the same way at that exact table. At exactly 8 o'clock, Elijah's phone began to ring. Grant smirked and answered it himself, certain he was in control. He had no idea who was calling. Stick around because the person on the other end of that call is about to turn this sheriff's entire world upside down. Subscribe now so you don't miss a single second of what happens next. Elijah Monroe had learned long ago that the way people looked at him usually said more about them than it ever said about him. At 41, he carried himself with a stillness that made loud men uncomfortable. He had spent his adult life refusing to give anyone the satisfaction of watching him lose control. 3 years earlier, his wife, Laura, had died of cancer. Since then, Elijah had raised their daughter, Emma, alone, one bedtime story and one school pickup at a time. Laura had once told him that raising a strong daughter was not enough. Emma also needed to know she never had to shrink herself just to make someone else comfortable. That lesson stayed with Elijah everywhere he went. 11 days before setting foot in Cedar Ridge, Elijah had been sworn in as the new director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. But he had not come to Cedar Ridge wearing that title. He came quietly because the Bureau had received 4 separate letters over 8 months describing a disturbing pattern. Black drivers and outsiders were stopped more often. People were demanded to show identification without breaking laws. Those who objected were labeled aggressive. Property disappeared from evidence rooms. People taken into custody were sometimes denied the chance to call their families. Complaints against the department seemed to vanish. Every letter pointed toward one man, Sheriff Richard Grant, who had controlled Cedar Ridge for 19 years. Grant never used language obvious enough to get himself in trouble. He spoke about protecting the community and trusting a lawman's instincts. But those instincts almost always pointed toward the same people: the poor, the black, and anyone without powerful people standing behind them. Elijah wanted to see the town for himself before authorizing a full federal investigation. He told almost no one he was coming. That morning, he had also promised Emma he would video call her at 8 o'clock before her first major school presentation. She had been nervous because a classmate told her that her father didn't look like someone who could run the FBI. Elijah had told her she never needed his title to prove her worth. At 7:15, Elijah entered the oldest diner in Cedar Ridge wearing an old jacket, gray sweater, jeans, and work boots. A waitress named Susan Bennett told him he could sit wherever he liked. He chose the second table by the window, with a clear view of the police station across the street. He ordered eggs, bacon, toast, and black coffee. At around 7:40, Sheriff Richard Grant walked in with 2 deputies. Frank Duncan was an older deputy who had spent years quietly following Grant's orders. Daniel Pierce was younger and still had a conscience, though he had rarely found the courage to use it against his boss. The moment Grant entered, conversation dropped. He walked directly to Elijah's table. "You're sitting at my table," Grant said. Elijah looked up calmly. "The waitress told me I could sit anywhere. I'll leave when I finish eating." Grant looked over Elijah's plain clothes. "What do you do for a living?" "I work for the federal government." Grant laughed. "What branch of the government hires people who dress like that?" A few nervous chuckles spread through the diner. An older white man nearby spoke up. "I sat in that same seat last week." Sheriff Grant greeted me with a smile. Grant ignored him. "Folks around here know who this table belongs to. Outsiders should learn some respect." Elijah slowly placed his fork down. Are you asking me to leave because this is your table? Or because you don't like someone like me sitting here? The diner went completely silent. Don't turn this into something it isn't, Grant snapped. The way you're treating me is exactly what's turning it into something, Elijah replied. Grant's jaw tightened. He announced that Elijah was acting suspiciously and obstructing an officer. Since when does eating breakfast and refusing to give up a public table count as obstruction? Elijah asked. Grant ordered him to stand. Elijah placed his fork down completely. I'm unarmed. I'm not resisting. My wallet is in my right jacket pocket. He said it because he knew facts mattered more than arguments. Grant never checked the wallet. Instead, he looked Elijah in the eyes. Men like you always say you're not looking for trouble right before trouble finds you anyway. Deputy Frank Duncan pulled Elijah from his chair and cuffed him. The metal bit into his wrists. Elijah could have ended everything by telling them exactly who he was. But he chose not to. Daniel Pierce's body camera was still recording. More than 40 witnesses were watching, and Grant was recreating almost exactly what those 4 letters had described. If Elijah revealed his identity, Grant could apologize, call it a misunderstanding, and bury the truth again. Elijah remembered something Laura once told him. Don't watch how people treat you after they learn you have power. Watch how they treat you before they know anything about you. So Elijah stayed silent. He let Grant lead him outside in handcuffs. Every word, every witness, and every camera remained evidence. Outside, Grant addressed the small crowd. This man was watching the police station, he announced. He refused a lawful order. Elijah kept his voice calm. I never refused a lawful order. I refused to give up a table you don't own. Grant told Duncan to write in the report that Elijah had been argumentative and hostile. Duncan immediately obeyed. Daniel Pierce stood nearby, his body camera still recording. A man named Thomas Delaney secretly recorded the scene on his phone. When Duncan noticed him, Thomas quickly lowered it. An older woman whispered that she had watched Grant wave 3 white teenagers through the same table only the week before. Susan heard her but remained silent. Elijah understood the real problem in Cedar Ridge. It wasn't always loud. Sometimes prejudice lived in the quiet difference between who was treated as a customer and who was treated as a threat. At 7:58, Elijah's phone lit up. Grant pulled it from his pocket. A photo of Emma in her school uniform filled the screen. You should be thinking about your daughter before you let the police have to deal with you like this, Grant said. For the first time, Elijah felt anger rise. Don't bring her into this. Grant smiled. Then start acting like a responsible parent. Elijah said nothing. He waited. Because he knew what would happen at 8 o'clock. Exactly at 8 o'clock, the phone rang. The screen showed a secured number. Grant answered. Hello? The voice belonged to Rebecca Whitaker, the agent responsible for Elijah's security coordination. This is a scheduled security check. I need to confirm the safety code with the individual assigned to this line. The owner of this phone is currently in police custody, Grant replied. If you're his lawyer, call back later. I need to speak with Elijah Monroe directly. He's not in a position to take calls. Rebecca's voice became colder. Who am I speaking with? Sheriff Richard Grant, Cedar Ridge Police Department. Where are you holding Elijah Monroe? Outside a diner on Main Street. He's being detained for obstruction and surveilling a police facility. Silence followed. Then Rebecca spoke. Sheriff Grant, listen carefully. You are currently holding the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Grant stared at Elijah. Do not move him. Do not search his vehicle. Do not power down any cameras on scene." Grant laughed in disbelief. "The director of the FBI doesn't look like this." Elijah met his eyes. "You just said out loud what you've been trying to hide from the beginning." Grant's smile disappeared. He ended the call, but it was already too late. The conversation had confirmed Elijah's identity, recorded Grant's statements, pinpointed the location, and triggered a federal response team. Grant immediately began giving orders. Search Elijah's rental car. Shut down Pierce's body camera. Collect the diner surveillance footage. Move Elijah inside the station. And write a report describing Elijah as aggressive. But Pierce refused. "It uploads automatically to the server," he said. "I can't delete it even if I wanted to." Grant stepped closer. "If you want to keep wearing that badge, remember who pinned it on you." Pierce did not move. It was the first time he had ever refused a direct order from Grant. Duncan searched Elijah's rental car. He found a family photograph, a drawing Emma had made, a rental agreement with Elijah's real name, and Laura's wedding ring. No weapon. No evidence of wrongdoing. Still, Grant ordered Duncan to create a vague report suggesting Elijah possessed materials connected to a government facility. Then they moved Elijah toward a patrol car. Before he could get inside, engines roared from the end of the street. 3 black SUVs turned into the parking lot. Federal agents stepped out. Rebecca walked forward first, displaying her credentials. "Federal Bureau of Investigation. This scene is being secured. Nobody leaves." Grant tried to reassert control. "Your man was arrested according to procedure." Rebecca ignored him and turned to Elijah. "Director, do you require medical attention?" The parking lot fell silent. Grant stared at Elijah. "Why didn't you say something?" Elijah answered quietly. "I told you exactly where my wallet was. You never checked because you had already decided who I was before you ever asked my name." Rebecca photographed the cuffs and documented the scene before ordering them removed. Once free, Elijah clarified his role. He would not personally direct the investigation. "Don't investigate how they treated the director of the FBI," he told the agents and witnesses. "Investigate how they treat someone they think has nobody standing behind them." But justice would not come instantly. Grant's attorney arrived within the hour. He claimed Elijah had traveled to Cedar Ridge without authorization, concealed his identity, provoked the sheriff, and was now abusing federal power to retaliate against a local officer. Grant filed an official report claiming Elijah had refused to identify himself, watched the police station, acted aggressively, reached toward his pocket, and caused officers to fear for their safety. Then investigators discovered something worse. 37 seconds of diner surveillance footage were missing from the exact moment Grant first approached Elijah. Local news outlets quickly twisted the story. One headline claimed the FBI director had abused federal power after a diner dispute. Washington ordered Elijah to leave Cedar Ridge and withdraw from the investigation to avoid any appearance of personal influence. Then Emma called. She had seen a short clip online showing only the argument. "Dad," she asked quietly, "did you actually cause trouble?" The question hurt more than the handcuffs. Elijah understood what Grant was trying to do. Turn him into the image prejudice expected to see, a dangerous, angry black man abusing power, instead of a father who had simply refused to surrender a public table. Elijah could not use his position to defend himself without making Grant's accusations seem stronger. So he stepped back. "I don't need you to believe me because of my title," he told Emma. "I just need you to wait until the whole truth comes out." "I still believe you," Emma replied. "But I want other people to see who you really are too." That settled something inside him. He could not win with rank. The evidence would have to speak. Elijah returned to Washington and formally withdrew from the investigation. Rebecca took over. The early investigation seemed to stall. The missing 37 seconds remained unexplained. Grant's report sat in the system as the official version. Several residents refused to speak because they feared Grant's power. Then Daniel Pierce walked into the federal office. He came without his attorney. He handed investigators the automatic backup copy of his body camera footage. It showed everything. Elijah remaining calm. Elijah identifying where his wallet was. Grant refusing to check it. Grant calling him a threat without evidence. Grant ordering Pierce to shut off his camera. And Grant instructing Duncan to write a report that did not match reality. Pierce knew turning over the footage could end his career. He handed it over anyway. Once the footage became official evidence, Cedar Ridge began to speak. Thomas Delaney gave investigators the video he had secretly recorded. Susan produced a backup diner camera that captured the missing 37 seconds from another angle. Gerald Collins described being held for 19 hours without charge and losing work tools that were never returned. Marion Hayes described watching her son get stopped 6 times in 3 months without receiving a ticket. One story became 2. 2 became 10. And 10 became a pattern. Investigators discovered that 14 reports had been edited after filing. 11 people had been detained without supporting documentation. Property logs did not match what victims reported missing. Black residents were repeatedly labeled aggressive despite footage showing otherwise. Duncan had a history of disabling his camera before controversial arrests. And prosecutor Patricia Lewis had repeatedly ignored complaints involving Grant's department. The evidence was no longer possible to dismiss. Grant was suspended in front of the same station he had controlled for 19 years. His weapon was taken. His badge was surrendered. His insignia was removed. He was now the subject of a federal civil rights investigation. 2 days later, Elijah met Grant on the courthouse steps. "I've helped black folks before," Grant insisted. "I've arrested plenty of white men too. You can't call me racist over one arrest." Elijah remained calm. Prejudice doesn't disappear because you treated a few people decently. It shows up in who you give the benefit of the doubt to and who you decide is dangerous before they've even opened their mouth. Grant tried again. "If you had just given up the table, none of this would have happened." "No," Elijah said. "If I had given up the table, this would still be happening to the next person who sat down in my place." He looked directly at Grant. "You didn't fall because you handcuffed the director of the FBI. You fell because you handcuffed too many black people, too many poor people, too many people you assumed nobody would ever call to save." Grant had no answer. In the following weeks, Grant faced federal charges for civil rights violations, falsifying records, and conspiracy to obstruct the investigation. Duncan was charged as an accomplice. Patricia Lewis came under investigation. Old cases were reopened. The evidence room was independently audited. Victims were given the opportunity to seek compensation. The state temporarily took control of the Cedar Ridge Police Department. Daniel Pierce was not magically made sheriff overnight. An interim sheriff was appointed while the department underwent reform. Pierce was assigned to evidence preservation, camera training, and community relations. A year of reforms and a transparent selection process would pass before he ever had the opportunity to run for sheriff himself. 17 days after that morning, Elijah returned to Cedar Ridge with Emma. He wore no suit and arrived in no federal vehicle. They walked into the diner like any other father and daughter. The room went quiet. But this silence was different. Thomas stood first. Susan stood next. Gerald and Marion followed. Soon, nearly everyone in the diner was standing. Nobody called Elijah director. They stood because he had allowed himself to be seen without power, so the town could finally see how it treated people who truly had none. Elijah and Emma sat at the same table by the window. Susan brought eggs and coffee for Elijah and pancakes for Emma. Before walking away, she stopped. "I knew it was wrong," she said. "I still stood there and did nothing." "Staying silent out of fear is something people can understand," Elijah replied gently. "But when that silence protects the person causing the harm, we have to decide whether our fear matters more than someone else's safety." Emma looked across the street. Daniel Pierce was walking out of the police station. "Is he the one who saved you?" she asked. Elijah shook his head. "Nobody saved me alone. One person kept his camera running. One person handed over a video. One person told the truth about what happened to them. Eventually, an entire town stopped pretending it hadn't seen anything." After breakfast, Rebecca arrived with a new case file. Emma looked worried. "Do you have to leave again?" Elijah checked his watch and closed the folder. "Tomorrow," he said. "Today I promised you the museum." Father and daughter walked out of the diner together. Cedar Ridge was still learning how to see itself clearly, one honest witness at a time. This story doesn't claim every officer is like Richard Grant, and it doesn't claim every conflict comes down to race. What it does say is this: the most dangerous kind of prejudice rarely arrives as a slur shouted in public. More often, it hides inside a double standard, where one person is presumed innocent while another has to prove they aren't a threat simply because of how they look. Grant didn't fall because he handcuffed a powerful man. He fell because he had spent 19 years handcuffing people he assumed nobody would ever call to save. And Elijah didn't win because he was the director of the FBI. He won because Daniel Pierce refused to turn off his camera. Because Thomas Delaney handed over his video. Because Susan found the courage to speak. Because ordinary people finally decided silence was no longer worth the price of someone else's safety. Justice doesn't begin when someone powerful walks through the door. It begins when everyday people decide that the truth of someone with no power at all still deserves to be heard. If this story moved you, don't scroll past it in silence either. Subscribe to the channel and stay for the next story.